The morning of February 9th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Arcangelo stood beneath the belly of a B-17 Flying Fortress at Polebrook Air Station in England, counting holes. Not metaphorically. Literally counting 117 punctures in the aluminum skin of the bomber that had returned from Wilhelmshaven 6 hours earlier. The aircraft, dubbed Liberty Bell, looked like someone had taken a giant cheese grater to its fuselage. Arcangelo, a maintenance crew chief with the 351st Bomb Group, ran his fingers along the jagged tears in the metal, each one a testament to German 88mm flak shells that had detonated nearby. The wings were Swiss cheese, the tail section resembled a colander, and yet, impossibly, the plane had flown home. The crew had walked away, and within 48 hours, Liberty Bell would fly again. This was not an anomaly. Across every American bomber base in England that winter, ground crews were witnessing the same paradox. Aircraft returned from missions over occupied Europe, looking like they should have fallen from the sky, but they hadn't. Conversely, some planes that seemed barely touched never came back at all. Something fundamental about how the US Army Air Forces understood aircraft vulnerability was wrong, and the consequences of that misunderstanding were measured in the lives of young men who climbed into aluminum coffins every morning, not knowing whether the armor protecting them was placed where it mattered most or where it mattered least. The question that would haunt military planners, statisticians, and combat air crews throughout 1943 and 1944 was deceptively simple. Where do you reinforce a bomber when you can only see the planes that survived? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The world Michael Arcangelo inhabited in February 1943 was one of industrial-scale air warfare unlike anything in human history. The combined bomber offensive, jointly conducted by the RAF and the US 8th Air Force, was predicated on a doctrine that had been developed in the interwar years by theorists like Billy Mitchell and Giulio Douhet. The belief that strategic bombing could cripple an enemy's industrial capacity and break civilian morale, potentially winning wars without the need for massive ground invasions. The Americans, unlike the British who had shifted to nighttime area bombing, remained committed to daylight precision bombing. The logic was straightforward: bomb factories, oil refineries, and transportation networks during the day when you could actually see your targets, and you could methodically dismantle the enemy's ability to wage war. But daylight bombing came with a price that no amount of pre-war theorizing had fully anticipated. The B-17 Flying Fortress and its successor, the B-24 Liberator, were designed to fly in tight formations combat boxes, where their combined defensive firepower from 50-caliber machine guns could theoretically fend off enemy fighters. The Flying Fortress earned its name from its bristling array of guns: 2 in the nose, 2 in a dorsal turret, 2 in a ventral ball turret, 2 in a tail turret, and 2 waist guns. On paper, a formation of bombers presented a nearly impenetrable wall of fire. The doctrine assumed that altitude, speed, formation integrity, and concentrated defensive fire would allow bombers to penetrate deep into German airspace and return with acceptable losses defined, chillingly, as 5% or less per mission. Reality had other plans. From the very first deep penetration raids in the summer of 1942, it became clear that the bomber offensive was going to be far costlier than anticipated. The Luftwaffe's fighters Fokker-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s proved aggressive and skilled, exploiting the bomber's blind spots and attacking head-on where the B-17's defensive armament was weakest. But even more punishing was the Flak, German anti-aircraft artillery, particularly the legendary 88mm Flak 18, 36, and 37 guns, filled the skies over German cities and industrial targets with thousands of exploding shells. Each shell burst into hundreds of white-hot fragments, traveling at supersonic speeds, capable of tearing through aluminum like paper. The psychological effect on bomber crews was profound. Flight Officer James O'Neill of the 91st Bomb Group later recalled the experience of flying through Flak over Bremen. It wasn't like fighter attacks where you could shoot back, where you felt like you had some control. Flak was impersonal, mathematical. They had your altitude, your speed, your heading. You just flew straight into a cloud of exploding steel, and there was absolutely nothing you could do about it except tighten your flak vest, pray, and maintain formation. Men who could handle fighters would break down during heavy flak. It felt like flying into a storm made of hatred. By early 1943, bomber losses were approaching unsustainable levels. The raid on Schweinfurt on August 17th cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers, 600 men in a single day. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14th, later known as Black Thursday, saw 60 more bombers lost out of 291 dispatched. These were not acceptable losses. These were catastrophic hemorrhaging of men and machines that, if continued, would make the entire strategic bombing campaign impossible to sustain. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers faster than they could be replaced, and trained aircrew even faster. The Army Air Force's response was multifaceted. They pushed for long-range fighter escorts, a program that would eventually produce the P-51 Mustang. They refined formation tactics. They improved bombing accuracy to reduce the number of missions required. And they attempted to make the bombers themselves more survivable through strategic armor placement. This last effort seemed straightforward enough. Study the damage on returning aircraft, identify where they were getting hit most frequently, and add armor to those locations. It was logical, empirical, and completely wrong. Enter Abraham Wald, a mathematician who would never fire a shot in anger, never climb into a bomber, never experience the terror of flak bursting at 25,000 feet, but whose insights would save more American lives than many combat aces. Wald was an unlikely figure in the machinery of war. Born in 1902 in Cluj, then part of Austria-Hungary, to a Jewish family, Wald had fled to the United States in 1938 as fascism consumed Europe. By 1942, he was working for the Statistical Research Group at Pasadena, Columbia University, a civilian organization tasked with applying advanced mathematics to military problems. The SRG was an extraordinary collection of minds, future Nobel laureates and pioneers of modern statistics, all focused on questions of survival and lethality. The problem presented to Wald's group in early 1943 was simple in its framing. The Army Air Forces had data on where returning bombers were damaged by flak and fighter fire. They wanted to know where to add armor. The aircraft could only carry so much additional weight before performance suffered, so choices had to be made. Should they reinforce the wings where so many holes appeared, the fuselage that seemed to attract so much damage, or spread the armor more evenly? The data was extensive. Ground crews like Archangelo's had been meticulously documenting every bullet hole, every flak puncture, every piece of shrapnel damage on returning aircraft. When the data was compiled and visualized, clear patterns emerged. The fuselage and wings showed far more damage than the engines and cockpit areas. The tail sections were pockmarked. The non-structural areas of the wings looked like they'd been through a shotgun blast. It seemed obvious where the armor should go. But Abraham Wald looked at the same data and saw something entirely different. He saw a profound absence. The holes in returning aircraft, he realized, represented only half of the story, and not the half that mattered most. Every hole in a returning bomber was, by definition, a wound that the aircraft had survived. The punctures in the fuselage were evidence that a bomber could absorb that damage and make it home. What Wald needed to understand was not where the returning planes were hit, but where the planes that didn't return were hit. And those planes, of course, couldn't be examined because they were scattered across occupied Europe or sunk in the North Sea or disintegrated in mid-air explosions. This was the heart of what would later be called survivorship bias, a logical error that occurs when we concentrate on things that passed a selection process while overlooking those that did not, typically because they're no longer visible. In the case of bomber damage analysis, the selection process was brutal and binary. Either an aircraft survived to return to base, or it didn't. The planes sitting on the tarmac in England represented the lucky ones, the survivors, the aircraft that had been hit in places that weren't catastrophically vulnerable. The absence of damage in certain areas, engines, cockpit, certain fuel lines, wasn't evidence that those areas weren't being hit. It was evidence that when those areas were hit, planes didn't come home. Wald's recommendation was counterintuitive to the point of seeming absurd. Don't add armour where the returning planes show damage. Add armour where they don't show damage. Reinforce the engines, not the fuselage. Protect the cockpit, not the wing's non-structural areas. Focus on the blank spaces in your data, not the holes you can see and count and measure. The initial reaction to Wald's analysis among many Army Air Forces officers was skepticism bordering on dismissal. It contradicted both common sense and the empirical evidence sitting on runways across England. Colonel Curtis LeMay, then commander of the 305th Bomb Group and later the entire strategic bombing campaign, was among the first senior officers to grasp the implications. LeMay was not a man given to abstract theorizing. He was a pragmatist who measured success in bombs on target and crews returning home. But he understood probability, and more importantly, he understood that the current approach was failing. Losses remained unacceptable. Something had to change. The Statistical Research Group's recommendations were implemented gradually, beginning in the spring of 1943. The changes were not dramatic overhauls, but carefully calculated redistributions of weight and protection. Additional armour plating was installed around the engines, particularly the vulnerable oil coolers that, if punctured, would cause an engine to seize within minutes. The cockpit received reinforced steel plates behind the pilot's seats and around the instrument panels. Fuel lines in critical areas were rerouted or given additional shielding. Self-sealing fuel tanks, which had already been implemented, received further improvements. Conversely, armour was actually removed from some areas. The fuselage sections that had shown such extensive damage on returning aircraft were lightened. The logic, as Wald had demonstrated mathematically, was that these areas could absorb damage without causing catastrophic failure. A hole in the aluminum skin of the fuselage was unpleasant. It meant noise, cold, and wind that could disorient crew members, but it wouldn't bring down the aircraft. A hole in an engine's oil system meant a dead engine, and a B-17 with two engines, out on the same side, couldn't maintain altitude. A 20mm cannon shell through the cockpit meant dead pilots and an uncontrolled aircraft. These were the wounds that killed bombers, not the spectacular but survivable punctures in the wings and fuselage. The technical specifications were precise. Each Wright R-1820 Cyclone engine on a B-17 received an additional 18 pounds of armour around critical components. The cockpit armour package added 65 pounds. In total, the modifications added approximately 200 pounds to the aircraft's empty weight, a significant but manageable increase that was offset by removing roughly 80 pounds of armour from non-critical areas. The net addition of 120 pounds represented a compromise between protection and performance, a mathematical optimization of survivability that would have been impossible without Wald's insight. But numbers on engineering diagrams meant nothing until they were tested in combat. The modified aircraft began reaching operational squadrons in late spring and early summer of 1943, just as the combined bomber offensive was intensifying. The missions grew larger and more ambitious. Gelsenkirchen, Hamburg, Regensburg, again Schweinfurt. The bombers flew deeper into Germany, stayed over target longer, and faced increasingly sophisticated German defences. The Luftwaffe was adapting, positioning fighter wings to intercept the bomber streams, and developing new tactics like head-on attacks that exploited the B-17's weakest defensive arc. German flak batteries were multiplying, their crews becoming more skilled at calculating the precise altitude and lead necessary to saturate a formation's flight path with exploding steel. Staff Sergeant Robert Cole, a waist gunner with the 306th Bomb Group, flew his first mission in a modified B-17 on June 13, 1943, targeting naval facilities at Kiel. In a letter to his family written 3 days later, a letter now preserved in the National Archives, Cole described the experience. "The flak was the worst I've ever seen, and this was only my 8th mission. Black puffs so thick you could almost walk on them. We took hits, lots of them. I counted holes afterward and stopped at 90. But here's the thing that's got everyone talking. We took a direct hit near the number 3 engine. Not a near miss, an actual hit. Shrapnel went everywhere. But the engine kept running. The armor they added saved it. In my first 7 missions, on the old ships, I saw 3 bombers go down because an engine got hit and seized. This time, we flew home on 4 engines. The new armor works." Cole's observation was not isolated. Throughout the summer and fall of 1943, bomber crews began noticing a pattern that matched what the statisticians had predicted, but which still seemed miraculous to the men experiencing it. Aircraft were taking catastrophic-looking damage and surviving. A B-24 from the 44th Bomb Group returned from a mission over Kiel with a hole in the fuselage large enough for a man to crawl through, the result of an 88mm shell that had entered below the waist gun position and exited through the top of the fuselage without detonating. The bomber's structure was compromised, but every system remained functional. The crew flew home. Conversely, aircraft losses due to engine failure or fire decreased measurably. When a bomber did go down due to flak damage, post-mission intelligence debriefs increasingly revealed that the fatal damage had occurred in areas that were now armoured on the modified aircraft. A B-17 from the 91st Bomb Group was seen exploding over Brunswick after what appeared to be a direct hit to the cockpit, an area that, on older models, had minimal protection. On the newer aircraft with enhanced cockpit armour, similar hits were survivable, or at least allowed the pilots enough time to give the bailout order. The statistical evidence became undeniable by late 1943. The loss rate for modified aircraft was measurably lower than for unmodified ones flying the same missions. The difference was not enormous, perhaps 1 to 1.5 percentage points per mission, but compounded over dozens of missions and hundreds of aircraft, it translated to dozens of bombers and hundreds of lives saved. More importantly, the psychological impact on crews was significant. The knowledge that their aircraft had been scientifically optimized for survival, that actual mathematicians had thought carefully about where to put the armor, gave crews a measure of confidence that bordered on superstition. Lieutenant James Stewart. Yes, the same James Stewart who would become a Hollywood legend flew B-24 Liberators with the 453rd Bomb Group. In his post-war interviews, Stewart recalled the conversation among crews about the armor modifications. "We called it the smart armor. Word got around that some mathematician had figured out where the armor actually needed to be, and it wasn't where everyone thought. At first, guys were skeptical. How could some professor who'd never been in combat know better than the ground crews who fixed shot-up planes every day? But then you'd see a ship come back with an engine that should have been dead, still running, and you'd see the armor had taken the hit. Or you'd hear about another group losing a plane to a cockpit hit, and you'd tap the steel plate behind your head and feel grateful that someone had done the math. The concept of survivorship bias extended beyond armor placement. The same logical framework that Wald applied to bomber damage could be applied to countless other aspects of military planning and equipment design. Why did so many pilots report that enemy fighters attacked from the sun? Not necessarily because attacking from the sun was more effective, but because pilots who were attacked from the sun and shot down couldn't report what they'd experienced. The attacks that succeeded left no witnesses. Similarly, why did certain types of missions seem less dangerous than others? Perhaps because the missions that were truly catastrophic resulted in such high losses that few crews survived to report the danger. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. the refinement of bomber survivability continued throughout 1944. As P-51 Mustangs began escorting bombers deep into Germany, the nature of the threat shifted. With fighter cover, the Luftwaffe's interceptors became less of a factor, but flak remained constant and deadly. German anti-aircraft defences actually intensified as the war progressed. By mid-1944, the Ruhr Valley alone contained over 2,000 heavy flak guns, and Berlin was defended by an estimated 3,000. The density of fire over major targets was such that bomber crews described it as flying through a solid wall of black smoke. The B-17G model, which entered service in late 1943, incorporated all of Wald's recommendations from the beginning of its production. It also added a chin turret beneath the nose with twin 50-caliber machine guns to address the head-on fighter attack vulnerability. The combination of improved armament and intelligently placed armor made the G model the most survivable variant of the Flying Fortress. Of the 8,680 B-17 seconds built, the G model accounted for 4,035, nearly half, and became the workhorse of the strategic bombing campaign's final phase. The crew of Memphis Belle, one of the most famous B-17 seconds of the war, flew their 25th and final mission on May 19, 1943. Just as the armour modifications were being implemented fleet-wide, their achievement completing a full tour, when the average life expectancy of a bomber was 15 missions, made them celebrities and propaganda symbols. But by 1944, as the modified aircraft proliferated, completing a 25-mission tour became statistically more achievable. The survival rate was still terrible by any reasonable standard. Roughly 35% of 8th Air Force aircrews, who began combat operations in 1943, were killed in action. But it was better than near-certain death that characterized the early months of the campaign. The human cost remained staggering. Between 1942 and 1945, the 8th Air Force alone lost approximately 4,500 heavy bombers to all causes over Europe. Each bomber carried a crew of 10. The arithmetic is brutal. 45,000 men lost in the European theatre from just one Air Force component of one service branch of one Allied nation. And that's only counting the aircraft that went down. Many more were so badly damaged that they crashed on landing or had to be scrapped. Thousands of airmen were wounded, many catastrophically. Yet within this context of industrial-scale slaughter, Abraham Wald's insight represented something profound, not a miracle cure, not a way to make war safe, but a marginal improvement that, multiplied across thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of missions, meant that hundreds of young men went home who otherwise wouldn't have. It meant that a waist gunner like Robert Cole could write a letter to his family after his 8th mission, instead of having his name added to the missing air crew reports. It meant that a pilot could survive a direct flak hit to his engine cowling and nurse his bomber back to England instead of spiralling into a German forest. The practical application of survivorship bias thinking extended into other areas of aerial warfare. The air forces began more carefully analysing the reports from crews who aborted missions due to mechanical issues. Previously, these crews were often viewed with suspicion. Were they actually experiencing problems, or were they looking for an excuse to avoid combat? But when analysts applied Wald's framework, they realized that the crews who aborted and returned safely provided valuable data about failure modes that weren't visible in the aircraft that completed missions. A bomber that turned back due to a faulty engine wasn't less brave. It was a data point about engine reliability under combat conditions. The aircraft that pressed on despite warning signs and didn't return left no data at all. Similarly, the air forces revised how they evaluated combat tactics. Formations that reported light enemy resistance weren't necessarily flying the best routes or using the most effective tactics. They might simply be the lucky ones. The formations that encountered heavy resistance and survived had learned lessons that needed to be studied and disseminated. But the formations that encountered heavy resistance and didn't survive had learned lessons that died with them. This created a systematic bias in tactical knowledge, where the most dangerous threats were underestimated because the people who encountered those threats most directly were no longer alive to report them. By the spring of 1945, as the strategic bombing campaign reached its crescendo and the Third Reich collapsed, the 8th Air Force had become a vastly more effective and efficient killing machine than it had been in 1942. The reasons were multiple: better fighter escorts, more aircraft, more experienced crews, deteriorating German defences, and improved tactics. But embedded in that improvement, invisible to the casual observer but measurable in the statistics, was the contribution of a mathematician who understood that the most important information was often the information you couldn't see. Abraham Wald never sought recognition for his contribution to the war effort. Unlike the bomber crews who flew into flak-filled skies or the engineers who designed the aircraft, Wald's battlefield was composed of numbers, probability distributions, and logical frameworks. He published his findings in a series of technical papers for the Statistical Research Group, documents that were classified during the war and remained obscure even after declassification. The title of his most influential paper was characteristically dry, a method of estimating plane vulnerability based on damage of survivors. It contained no dramatic prose, no acknowledgement of the lives it would save, just mathematical proofs and statistical methodologies. Wald continued his work with the SRG throughout the war, applying statistical analysis to problems ranging from the optimal thickness of armor for different threats to the ideal spacing of sequential bombs to maximize damage to submarine pens. After the war, he returned to academic mathematics, becoming a professor at Columbia University, where he made significant contributions to statistical decision theory and sequential analysis. His work laid foundations for entire fields of modern statistics that are now applied to everything, from medical trials to quality control in manufacturing. He died in 1950 in a plane crash in India, a bitter irony for a man who had spent years calculating how to make aircraft safer. He was 48 years old. The bomber crews, who benefited from Wald's insights, mostly never knew his name. They knew that newer aircraft seemed to survive better, that the armor had been improved. But the mathematical reasoning behind those improvements remained classified and obscure. For men like Staff Sergeant Michael Arcangelo, the ground crew chief we met at the beginning of this story, the evidence was visceral and immediate. Arcangelo remained at Polebrook Air Station through 1944, supervising maintenance, on B-17 seconds of the 351st Bomb Group. In his personal diary, later donated to the mighty 8th Air Force Museum, he noted the change in damage patterns as modified aircraft became standard. The newer ships take different hits. Still plenty of holes, but they come back. Fewer engine fires, fewer losses to what should have been survivable damage. The boys in engineering did something right. By the summer of 1944, the strategic bombing campaign had reached a scale that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, was supported by massive air superiority that the 8th and 9th Air Forces had carved out through sheer attrition. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was being systematically destroyed, not primarily by combat losses, though those were substantial, but by the destruction of its fuel supplies, training infrastructure, and manufacturing capacity. The bombers that Wald had helped make more survivable were now operating in an environment where German fighter opposition was sporadic and Flak remained the primary threat. The statistics from this period tell a story of industrial warfare at its apex. In 1944 alone, the 8th Air Force dropped 362,000 tons of bombs on German targets, more than in all previous years combined. They flew over 300,000 sorties, and they lost approximately 2,000 bombers, still a horrific number representing 20,000 crewmen, but a loss rate of less than 1% per sortie, down from the 4 to 5% rates that had characterized 1943. Multiple factors contributed to this improvement: fighter escort, German fuel shortages, Luftwaffe losses, and crew experience. But embedded in that statistical improvement was the contribution of armor placed where mathematics said it should go, rather than where intuition suggested. The concept that Wald identified survivorship bias outlived the war and the man who named it. In the decades following 1945, researchers and analysts in fields far removed from aerial warfare began recognizing the same logical trap. Medical researchers realized that studying only patients who survived a disease gave an incomplete picture of the disease's progression and lethality. Business analysts understood that studying only successful companies, while ignoring the vastly larger number of failed enterprises, would lead to completely wrong conclusions about what strategies led to success. Engineers designing safety systems recognized that studying only accidents where the safety system failed, while ignoring all the times the system succeeded invisibly, would lead to poor design choices. The mutual fund industry provides perhaps the clearest modern example. Studies that show mutual funds outperforming the market over 20-year periods often suffer from survivorship bias. They only include funds that existed for the entire period. Funds that performed poorly were closed or merged out of existence, disappearing from the dataset entirely. When researchers account for these dead funds, the average performance of the mutual fund industry looks dramatically worse. The surviving funds, like Wald's surviving bombers, present a misleadingly positive picture because they've already passed through the filter of selection. In medicine, clinical trials face the same challenge. If a treatment is so ineffective or has such severe side effects that patients drop out of the study, analyzing only the patients who completed the study will make the treatment appear more effective than it actually is. The patients who benefited least or suffered most are missing from the final data. Modern clinical trial protocols require intent-to-treat analysis that includes all patients who were initially enrolled, not just those who completed the treatment. A direct application of the principle Wald articulated in 1943. Even evolutionary biology carries echoes of survivorship bias. Every living organism is, by definition, descended from an unbroken chain of survivors, stretching back 4 billion years. The organisms we can study are the ones whose ancestors successfully navigated every extinction event, climate change, predator, and disease in Earth's history. The vastly larger number of species that went extinct, an estimated 99% of all species that ever lived, left no or limited fossil evidence of their adaptations and survival strategies. Our understanding of successful evolutionary strategies is therefore biased toward characteristics that promoted survival in the specific environmental conditions that occurred, not necessarily the characteristics that would be optimal under different circumstances. The military continued to apply Wald's framework long after World War II. During the Vietnam War, Air Force analysts studied battle damage on returning A-4 Skyhawks and F-4 Phantoms, consciously looking for the absence of damage rather than its presence. They recognized that the areas showing no hits on returning aircraft were likely the critical vulnerability zones. The principle influenced the design of the A-10 Thunderbolt, an aircraft specifically built around the concept of survivability with redundant systems, armored cockpit, and engines placed high on the fuselage, where they were shielded from ground fire. The A-10's designers had internalized Wald's lesson: plan for the damage you can't see on the aircraft that made it home. Modern aircraft design, both military and civilian, incorporates sophisticated probabilistic analysis of failure modes that descends directly from the statistical research group's work. When Boeing or Airbus designs a new airliner, teams of engineers don't just look at what failed on previous aircraft. They systematically analyze what could fail, including scenarios that haven't been observed because any aircraft experiencing those particular failures didn't survive to be studied. The entire field of fault tree analysis, a systematic method of identifying potential failures in complex systems, is an elaboration of the principle Wald articulated. The most dangerous failures are often the ones you haven't seen yet, because they're catastrophic. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Wald's work is not in any specific application, but in the broader epistemological lesson it teaches about truth, evidence, and the limits of empirical observation. We naturally trust what we can see, measure, and analyze. The holes in returning bombers were concrete, countable, and seemingly probative. They represented empirical evidence that any reasonable person would consider relevant to the question of where to add armor. Yet that evidence, without the proper analytical framework, was worse than useless. It was actively misleading. It would have led to armor placement that protected against survivable damage while leaving aircraft vulnerable to catastrophic hits. This is deeply unsettling. It suggests that in any complex system where we can only observe the survivors, and most real-world systems share this characteristic, our intuitive understanding of cause and effect may be systematically wrong. The businesses we study as success stories may have succeeded despite their strategies rather than because of them. The survivors of disasters may have survived due to factors completely different from what they believe saved them. The historical events we know about may be wildly unrepresentative of the historical events that actually occurred, biased toward outcomes and narratives that left surviving records. During the Blitz, the German bombing campaign against Britain in 1940 and 1941, Londoners developed elaborate folklore about survival. People believed that taking shelter in underground stations was safer than staying in surface shelters, that certain neighborhoods were luckier than others, that specific behaviors during raids increased your chances of survival. Some of these beliefs were true, but many were examples of survivorship bias. The people whose strategies failed weren't around to report that failure. The survivors attributed their survival to whatever they had done, but the actual determinant of survival was often simply whether a bomb happened to land on that particular spot, a factor entirely outside anyone's control. The scientific method itself is designed in part to combat survivorship bias. When researchers conduct controlled experiments, they don't just study the outcomes that occurred. They compare them to control groups and carefully account for selection effects. When epidemiologists study disease, they don't just look at the people who got sick, they compare them to populations who didn't. The entire apparatus of modern statistical inference is, in a sense, an elaboration of Wald's insight that the most important information is often the information you cannot directly observe and must infer from patterns of absence. By April 1945, the strategic bombing campaign in Europe was effectively over. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. German cities and industrial centers lay in ruins. The debate about the morality and effectiveness of strategic bombing, a debate that continues to this day, was just beginning, but the tactical question of how to keep bombers alive long enough to deliver their payloads had been answered through a combination of fighter escort, overwhelming numbers, and scientifically optimized armor placement. Michael Arcangelo returned to the United States in June 1945, after witnessing the departure of the last B-17 mission from Polbrook. In his final diary entry from England, he wrote about the aircraft he'd maintained. Liberty Bell flew 49 missions. Most ships didn't make it to 20. She took more than 500 documented hits, probably more we never found. She brought everyone home every time. I don't know if that was skill, luck, or engineering, probably all three. But I'm grateful to whoever figured out where to put the armor, because some of those hits should have been fatal. Liberty Bell survived the war and was eventually scrapped in 1946, her aluminum recycled into the post-war economy. Of the 12,731 B-17 seconds built during the war, fewer than 50 survive today, most in museums. They stand as monuments to the 50,000 American airmen who died in the skies over Europe and to the strategic bombing campaign that remains one of the most controversial aspects of Allied conduct in World War II. But within their aluminum skins, in the placement of their armor plating, in the engineering specifications that determined where steel plates were installed and where they were, omitted, is embedded a different kind of memorial, a testament to the power of clear thinking in the face of obvious evidence. Abraham Wald looked at damaged aircraft and saw not proof of vulnerability but evidence of resilience. He recognized that the absence of damage was more informative than its presence. He understood that the most important data points were the ones that didn't make it back to be counted. When Staff Sergeant Arcangelo counted holes in Liberty Bell on that February morning in 1943, he was looking at evidence, real, tangible, countable evidence. Every hole told a story of a near miss, of a shell that exploded nearby but not near enough, of shrapnel that punctured aluminum but not life. What he couldn't count, couldn't see, couldn't even know to look for, were all the places Liberty Bell wasn't hit. Those blank spaces, those patches of undamaged metal, contained the real secret of survival. They marked the zones where a hit meant death, where damage meant disaster, where the aircraft that were struck didn't come home to be examined. In the end, the profound irony at the heart of this story is that truth hides in absence as much as presence. The bombers that made it home taught valuable lessons, but the most important lessons were taught by the bombers that didn't return silent witnesses to vulnerabilities that had to be inferred rather than observed, understood through logic rather than experience, protected against not because we saw the damage, but because we understood what it meant when we didn't. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.